I kind of have this anxiety that I live with constantly, and it's this nagging thought in the back of my head that I'm always trying to sort through and figure out. And it's the idea of, am I where God has called me to be? Christians kind of make this big deal out of your calling and what has God called you to do and where has He called you to be. And I think we can sometimes over freak out about like missing it. It's like, I missed my moment to serve God, or I missed my moment to walk in His calling. And I know I freak out. Like, I live in anxiety of how old I am. I'm 25 years old and I constantly feel like I'm getting too old already. Like, if I get any older, I'm gonna miss out on God's ability to work and do amazing things in my life. And that's such a weird and messed up philosophy that I can't seem to get out of. But I want us to work through today. Are you where God wants you to be? And I think the Bible and my experience and all the people who walk through what does it mean to follow God can kind of give us a little bit of kind of a roadmap of figuring out how to know if you're doing what God has called you to do, and how to know if you're where God has called you currently. And so the first thing I want to start out with in this idea of how do you know if you're where God has called you is the idea of patience is power. And so you have to take a breath and go nice and slow sometimes. And that can be stressful for some people. I know, especially for my generation. I was reading a study the other day that said millennials have a hard time slowing down and realizing that world change doesn't happen overnight. Most people in my age demographic believe that they can change the world in a week and still have enough time to have a late brunch on Friday. And so it's hard for people to really take a breath and to realize, man, sometimes you have to be patient, and then you'll move into what God has called you to be. Sometimes patience of realizing that God is preparing you for the next step in your life is really important. And the best example we have of this, which always blows my mind, is the fact that Jesus didn't start His ministry until He was 30 years old. For me, that's insane. I'm freaking out because I'm 25 and I feel like I don't have enough time left to make an impact for God. And meanwhile, Jesus decided to take until He was 30 before He stepped into the public scene. He even has moments where he's talking to his mom and John and he says, hey, don't you know my time has not yet come? He's sitting there and he's patiently waiting. And it's not for lack of ability. One of the interesting things that we see is when Jesus was 12 years old, He was in the temple astounding the teachers and the scholars of the temple with His knowledge of the Bible. He clearly had ability by the time he was 15, 16, 17, 18, but he chose instead to wait until God moved and it was time for him to step out into ministry. And that's just absolutely wild to me, that this idea of sometimes God is preparing you now and getting you ready, or even maybe He's not preparing you, but He's preparing the circumstances around you for you to be able to move into what He's called you to. And so sometimes an extra bit of patience is required. And so that's an important point that I want you to focus on, man. Maybe God has you in a season where He just wants you to be patient and to be ready and to be preparing for what's gonna happen next in your life. So sometimes just because nothing seems to be happening doesn't mean nothing is happening. See, we kind of freak out and we look in through the eyes of this world, we look around and see that it doesn't seem like our job we're not making enough money, or our ministry is effective enough, or enough people around us have been saved, or our family isn't in the right place yet. But the reality is God is preparing your circumstances and preparing you to step into the next season of where you're going. The next thing I want to kind of focus on is this idea that God will assure you that His presence is with you. So for me, I remember when I decided to come on staff at Restoration Church, it was a big, stressful moment for me. It was me stepping outside of my comfort zone. I had to go into somewhere I wasn't prepared to go. For me, I grew up and I always planned on staying in Vermont and doing ministry there for the rest of my life. But slowly, God began to open doors and allow me to move forward. And next thing I know, I've decided to take this position at Restoration Church, which came with a huge pay cut, came with the loss of a house. I was in a parsonage that the church was provided, into moving into this little teeny apartment that was under Pastor Nate's house. And I just remember the anxiety of the moment I moved into that house. We moved into this apartment, and so me and my wife went from a 4-bedroom house. We'd been married for less than a year at this point. We moved into this little apartment that was probably 200 square feet maximum. I just remember sitting there and just freaking out, like I made all the wrong decisions. I'm not a good husband. I'm not a good leader of my house. I'm not a good pastor. I've done all these things wrong. I didn't hear from God. I don't know what's going on, and living in that anxiety for 2 days. The next day, so we moved in Friday, and come Sunday, we're finally going to church. This is the first time we're gonna go to Restoration Church as a staff member, and I remember just coming in, and Pastor Nate preached a message that just settled my heart. Like in that moment, like it was exactly everything I needed to hear. It was everything I had ever wanted in a church. It was everything I ever wanted to be a part of. And in that moment, I realized, God, you did call me here. There's similar examples in the Bible that we see. So Moses, when he decides that he's standing before God, speaking to him as a burning bush, and he's freaking out. And one of the things he says is, who am I that I should go and set the Israelites free from the Egyptians? And God says, surely I will go with you. And that's the most important line right there, is there's that moment of who am I? And just like I came to that place where I was like, who am I? Because all I felt like was, man, I am not qualified to be here. I made the wrong decision. I'm the wrong person. I'm in the wrong place. God settled me by reminding me, it's not about you, it's about me. Surely I will go with you. And it's not your ability or anything that you can do, but instead, it's the one who's sending you and walking with you. And so he'll assure you of his presence in some way. He'll make sure that you feel, you might feel on edge, but he's gonna be there, and he's gonna be reminding you and uplifting you and holding you and preparing you and saying, no, this is where you're supposed to be. I'm right there with you. So that's another thing. And then the last thing that kind of defines how do you know if you're where God's called you, help you get a gauge, and this is probably the most practical one, is you have to be moving in some direction in order for God to tell you where you are. And so for me, I think about it this way, this is the best way I can understand it, and this is what I always tell people when they say, I don't know what God's called me to do, and this is always the advice I give them, no matter the circumstance. I say, I'm terrible with directions. So for me, I can get lost in my hometown, and I lived there for 22 years. And it's a town of 7,000 people, and it's not that big. I will somehow manage to get lost so easily. So I use a GPS everywhere I go. I definitely do that here in New Hampshire. I'm constantly GPSing where I have to go. And there's always this moment when you turn on your GPS, at least for me, when I'm sitting there, and the GPS, you turn it on, you hit directions, and then it just starts kind of spinning because it doesn't know what direction you're facing. So it can't tell. It can't lock on to how to tell you where to go next. And so what I have to do is I'll be in the parking lot and my GPS is kind of just spinning or trying to figure out where to go, and I'll start driving. And so as I start driving, the GPS finally locks onto the direction I'm headed, and it guides me whether I'm going the right way or not. And so I think our walk with God is almost exactly similar. The reality is you have got to start moving somewhere before God can redirect your steps. You can't, a car that's not moving, you can't tell it where to go, but a car that is moving, you can correct if it's going down the wrong path. And many people kind of take this philosophy of, I'm going to wait, I'm gonna sit here, I'm not gonna do anything before I start to move forward. And the first move, let me give you this encouragement, the first move you always make when you're trying to figure out what direction to go is you start with serving. Are you serving God with where you're at? Because if you're not serving him with where you're at, he's not going to tell you where to go next. And this comes up in Galatians. It says, you, my brothers and sisters, you were called to be free, but do not use your freedom to indulge in the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love. See, Paul here is saying, you have freedom to do, your flesh is going to tell you to do nothing. It's going to tell you to not do anything, but don't use that freedom to serve yourself. use it to serve others. So that's the first, that's the best way to begin to figure out, man, what direction has God called me to begin to move in? You start with service, because if you're serving where you're at, God can then begin to guide your steps into the next place in life. So I just want to encourage you with all those things, and to remember as you figure out, man, am I where God has called me to be? The first thing is patience is power. Remember, it's not going to happen overnight. God's presence will assure you He's there. That's going to be calming. It's going to be relaxing when you're doing what He's called you to do. And then third and finally is start moving so He can guide your steps. So as you pray this week, as you think this week about whether or not you're where God has called you, think, am I serving? Am I being patient? And do I feel His presence?